Hello and welcome to... Well, this isn't going to be one of our usual lighthearted romps through the whimsical world of international finance. No, tonight things are a bit more dire. Imagine, if you will, waking up one morning to find your life savings have become about as valuable as a used teabag. That's right, your retirement plan is now enough to buy half a latte. And just as you're processing that delightful information, the price of everything in the supermarket doubles. By lunchtime, riots have broken out. Now you might think, classic dystopian fiction, always good for a laugh. But this isn't some work of grim fantasy. This, my friends, is the current reality for millions across Asia. From once booming tourist hotspots to nations swimming in oil, economies are cratering like poorly built sandcastles. Governments are collapsing faster than a Jenga tower after 6 pints of Guinness. And for millions, basic survival has become a daily battle. Fun stuff, right? So buckle up, because over the next few chapters we're diving headfirst into the stories of 10 Asian nations teetering on the brink of economic oblivion. We'll explore why these crises are happening, why you should give a damn even if you can't find these countries on a map, and why the domino effect of their collapse could send shockwaves across the globe. Because believe you me, if you think America's got economic problems, you haven't seen anything yet. Sri Lanka. Just the name conjures images of pristine beaches, ancient temples, delicious tea, and... Wait, is that the sound of a collapsing economy I hear? Turns out paradise has a bit of a debt problem, and by a bit I mean a holy mother of pearl. How did they let it get this bad kind of problem? You see, in 2022, inflation in Sri Lanka decided to take the express elevator to hell, skyrocketing to a whopping 69.8%. That's not inflation, that's your money staging a bloody coup against basic mathematics. As if that wasn't bad enough, the country then decided to default on a measly $83 billion of debt. Now you might be thinking, 83 billion? That's cute, America does that before breakfast, and you'd be right. But for a country like Sri Lanka, whose economy relied heavily on tourism, well, let's just say COVID wasn't exactly the economic stimulus package they were hoping for. Tourists stopped coming, dollars stopped flowing, and suddenly that 83 billion started to look less like a rounding error and more like a gaping chasm of financial despair. The result? The kind of political and social unrest that makes you long for the halcyon days of, well, pretty much any other time in history. Leaders fled the country faster than a pack of rats abandoning a sinking ship, leaving the good people of Sri Lanka to deal with the economic apocalypse they'd created. So how did this tropical paradise end up as a cautionary tale on the dangers of economic mismanagement? Well, it's a story as old as time itself. Government corruption, a dash of over-reliance on imports, and a sprinkle of global pandemic to really spice things up. Think of it like a financial version of those My First Economic Meltdown playsets you can buy for children. You see, for years, Sri Lanka's government had been living the high life on borrowed money, funding ambitious infrastructure projects with little regard for how they were going to pay it all back. It's like maxing out your credit card on a solid gold jet ski. Sure, it's fun at the time, but eventually those bills are going to come due. And when they did, well, let's just say Sri Lanka found itself about as popular with international lenders as a vegan at a sausage fest. Add to that a heavy reliance on imports for basic necessities, a global pandemic that brought tourism to its knees, and a healthy dose of climate change-induced agricultural woes, and you've got yourself a recipe for economic disaster. But here's the kicker: Sri Lanka's story isn't unique. It's a stark warning sign for other debt-laden nations, a canary in the coal mine of global economic instability. Because if it can happen to a country once considered a model of development, it can happen anywhere. Right, let's move on from one economic dumpster fire to another, shall we? This time we're talking about Pakistan. And before you ask, no, their economic woes have nothing to do with starting a cricket rivalry with India. Although that would be a much more entertaining story, wouldn't it? No, Pakistan's problems are far more complex and far more depressing. Picture this: in 2023, the country's foreign exchange reserves dwindled to a paltry $3 billion. That's right, $3 billion with a B. Now, $3 billion might sound like a lot to you, but it's roughly the amount Jeff Bezos makes while waiting for the Amazon delivery guy to find his front door. For a nation of over 240 million people, it's not exactly what you'd call a comfortable financial cushion. As you can imagine, this led to some rather unpleasant consequences. Inflation decided to have a go at Sri Lanka's record, soaring past 40%. Families struggled to put food on the table, fuel became a luxury, and the only thing growing faster than the price of onions was a sense of national despair. But wait, there's more! Because as if economic meltdown wasn't enough, Pakistan also decided to throw in a healthy dose of political turmoil for good measure. The arrest of former Prime Minister Imran Khan plunged the country further into uncertainty, while the IMF, ever the benevolent overlords of international finance, circled like vultures. offering bailout loans with conditions that would make even the most hardened austerity advocate wince. Afghanistan. A nation synonymous with resilience now finds itself grappling with a new, insidious enemy: economic collapse. Remember the chaotic withdrawal of US forces in 2021? Well, buckle up because the aftershocks are far from over. Since the Taliban seized control, Afghanistan's economy has been in free fall, with the International Monetary Fund estimating a staggering 20% drop in GDP. Let me repeat that, 20%. That's like finding out your retirement fund invested solely in Betamax and handlebar mustaches. This isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet, folks. This is about the millions of Afghans facing a daily struggle for survival. The country's assets remain frozen, international aid has dwindled to a trickle, and the threat of ISIS-K attacks casts a long shadow over any hope of recovery. You'd think a global pandemic would inspire some international camaraderie, a bit of we're all in this together spirit. But no, not for Afghanistan. It's like the world decided to stage an intervention, then promptly forgot to invite the guest of honor. The most heartbreaking consequence of this economic meltdown: the plight of Afghanistan's children. Imagine being a parent, so desperate to feed your family that selling your own child seems like the only option. That's the horrifying reality for countless Afghan families today. The United Nations estimates that over half of Afghanistan's population is facing acute hunger. This isn't just about skipping a meal or two, this is about chronic malnutrition, stunting development, and condemning an entire generation to a life of hardship. And as if things couldn't get any worse, the Taliban, in their infinite wisdom, have decided that women should be erased from public life. Banned from working, banned from education, essentially banned from existing. Because, when you're facing economic Armageddon, the best course of action is to alienate half your population. The world's silence on Afghanistan is deafening. We cannot and must not stand idly by as an entire nation teeters on the brink. History will judge us harshly for our inaction. Remember Myanmar? The nation that dared to dream of democracy only to be dragged back into the abyss of military rule? Well, the situation there has gone from bad to please. Someone airdrop a copy of the Geneva Convention's bad. Since the 2021 coup, Myanmar's economy has been in a state of utter freefall. The kyat, their currency, has lost a jaw-dropping 50% of its value. Inflation is running rampant at over 30%. And to top it all off, a staggering 1.5 million people have been displaced by the ongoing violence. Now you might think, well, surely the international community has slapped some sanctions on these military goons, right? And you'd be right, they have. But much like trying to stop a runaway train with a stern letter of disapproval, the impact has been, shall we say, underwhelming. Meanwhile, in the rebel-held territories, it's a different kind of struggle. These brave souls are fighting tooth and nail for their freedom, but they're outgunned, outmanned, and running out of time. It's like watching a David versus Goliath match where someone forgot to give David a slingshot, or rocks, or any hope of winning. The true cost of this crisis? It's impossible to quantify. We're talking about an entire generation traumatized by violence, poverty, and the loss of their future. Imagine being a child witnessing your country crumble around you, your education disrupted, your dreams shattered. The statistics are grim. Over half of Myanmar's population is now living below the poverty line. That's not just a statistic, that's millions of lives upended, millions of futures hanging in the balance. And what's the international community doing about it? Well, aside from the aforementioned strongly worded letters and the occasional finger-wagging, not nearly enough. It's like watching a house fire and debating the merits of different fire extinguishers while the flames spread. The people of Myanmar deserve better. They deserve our support, our solidarity, and most importantly, our action. The world cannot afford to turn a blind eye to their plight. North Korea. The land of Kim Jong-un's questionable haircuts, elaborate military parades, and a truly baffling obsession with Dennis Rodman. But behind the facade of this bizarre dictatorship lies a chilling reality: economic collapse on a scale rarely seen in the modern world. For decades, North Korea has been subjected to crippling international sanctions, designed to pressure the regime into abandoning its nuclear ambitions. However, these sanctions have had a devastating unintended consequence. They've turned the country into an economic wasteland, pushing its citizens to the brink of starvation. Forget about iPhones and fancy coffee shops in North Korea. Basic necessities like food and medicine are in desperately short supply. The country's healthcare system is on the verge of collapse, with hospitals lacking even the most basic equipment and medication. It's like stepping back in time to the dark ages, only with worse haircuts. And if you think things are tough for the average North Korean, spare a thought for the country's elite. One wrong move, one ill-timed joke about Kim Jong-un's taste in sunglasses, and you could find yourself on the wrong end of a purge. It's like living in a real-life game of Squid Game, only with less prize money and more gulags. The most heartbreaking aspect of North Korea's economic woes is that they're entirely man-made. This isn't a case of natural disaster or some unforeseen global crisis. This is a direct result of the Kim regime's disastrous policies and its iron-fisted grip on power. Workers in North Korea often earn their wages in rice, not money. Imagine trying to pay your rent or buy groceries with a sack of rice. It's like something out of a dystopian novel, only less subtle. Meanwhile, satellite images reveal the grim reality of North Korea's agricultural struggles. Fields lie barren, harvests are failing, and the threat of famine looms large. It's a stark reminder that while Kim Jong-un dines on imported delicacies, his people are struggling to survive. The big question is, how long can this charade continue? How long before the North Korean people, pushed to the brink of despair, rise up and demand change? The world watches with bated breath, hoping for a peaceful resolution but bracing for the possibility of chaos and upheaval. Lebanon, once the Paris of the Middle East, now a cautionary tale of how quickly a nation can implode. We're talking faster than a Kardashian marriage, faster than you can say financial mismanagement. The Lebanese pound? It's lost 98% of its value. That's not a typo, folks. If the pound was a boxer, it wouldn't be down for the count. It would be buried under the ring. People are struggling to afford basic necessities, food, medicine, electricity, all luxuries now. Imagine having to choose between feeding your family or keeping the lights on. That's the reality for millions in Lebanon. And the government, they're about as useful as a chocolate fireguard. Remember the 2020 Beirut port explosion? The one caused by improperly stored ammonium nitrate that devastated the city, killed hundreds, and left 300,000 homeless? Yeah, well, 2 years on, there's been zero accountability. No one has been held responsible. It's like the investigation itself vanished in the blast. But hey, at least the blackouts are regular, right? Hospitals are running out of supplies, the streets are filled with garbage, and the only thing booming in Lebanon is the black market. This is what a failed state looks like, folks. And the truly terrifying thing? Lebanon might just be the canary in the coal mine. Section 2. Echoes of Syria. Lebanon sits on a geopolitical fault line bordered by Syria, Israel, and Cyprus. This tiny nation has always been a pressure cooker of regional tensions. But now, with its economy in ruins and its people desperate, the situation is becoming dangerously volatile. The Syrian civil war just next door has already spilled over into Lebanon, with refugees flooding across the border and extremist groups exploiting the chaos. Now, with Lebanon itself teetering on the brink, the risk of a wider regional conflict is growing by the day. And let's not forget about Hezbollah, the powerful Shia militant group and political party that holds significant sway in Lebanon. They're backed by Iran, which adds another layer of complexity to this already explosive mix. It's a geopolitical game of Jenga, and someone just pulled a really important block. The international community can't afford to ignore Lebanon's plight. If this nation collapses, the consequences will be felt far beyond its borders. We're talking about a humanitarian catastrophe, a breeding ground for extremism, and a potential trigger for a wider regional war. So yeah, maybe pay attention. Laos, the landlocked nation in Southeast Asia known for its stunning landscapes and laid-back culture, is facing a crisis of epic proportions. And by epic, I mean the kind of epic that makes the Greek myths look like a children's book. You see, Laos owes China a lot of money. Like a lot of money. We're talking about $14.5 billion worth of debt, most of it tied to massive infrastructure projects like dams, railways, and special economic zones. These projects were supposed to transform Laos into a land-linked economic powerhouse. Instead, they've saddled the country with a mountain of debt it can't possibly repay. Now, you might be thinking, John, debt isn't inherently bad. Sometimes you need to borrow money to invest in your future. And you'd be right. But here's the thing. China's loans aren't exactly known for their favorable terms. It's less borrow a cup of sugar and more sign over your firstborn child. As a result, Laos is now economically beholden to China, which has raised concerns about debt trap diplomacy. That's a fancy way of saying that China is using debt to gain leverage over Laos and advance its own strategic interests in the region. It's like that friend who always offers to pay for dinner, but then expects you to do their laundry for a month. Section 2. A generation in flight. If being drowning in debt wasn't enough, Laos is also grappling with soaring inflation. Fuel prices have doubled, food costs are skyrocketing, and the local currency, the kip, is in freefall. It's enough to make your head spin faster than a Laotian folk dance. Adding insult to injury, a dengue fever outbreak is overwhelming the country's already fragile healthcare system. Hospitals are overflowing, medical supplies are running low, and people are dying from preventable diseases. It's a humanitarian crisis unfolding in slow motion. Faced with this toxic cocktail of economic hardship and health risks, it's no surprise that many young Laotians are choosing to flee their homeland. They're leaving behind their families, their culture, and everything they've ever known in search of a better life elsewhere. This brain drain is further weakening Laos, depriving it of the skilled workers and young minds it needs to rebuild. It's a vicious cycle of despair, and it's unclear how Laos will break free from China's grip and chart a new course for itself. But hey, at least the scenery is still nice, right? Bangladesh, a land of vibrant culture, bustling cities, and a history marked by both triumph and tragedy, is facing a perfect storm of economic and environmental challenges. And by perfect storm, I mean the kind of storm that makes Hurricane Katrina look like a light drizzle. The Bangladeshi taka, once a symbol of the nation's hard-won economic progress, has taken a nosedive, plummeting 25% in value. It's like watching a prize-winning pigeon suddenly forget how to fly. This currency crisis is fueled by a toxic cocktail of factors including rising global inflation, supply chain disruptions caused by the pandemic, and of course the war in Ukraine. But Bangladesh's economic woes run deeper than just a weak currency. The country is heavily reliant on garment manufacturing, which accounts for a whopping 80% of its exports. But with rising production costs and waning global demand, this economic engine is sputtering. To make matters worse, Bangladesh is on the front lines of climate change. Rising sea levels, more frequent and intense cyclones, and erratic rainfall patterns are wreaking havoc on the country's coastal regions, displacing millions and threatening its fragile ecosystem. It's like Mother Nature is playing a cruel game of whack-a-mole, and Bangladesh is the mole. Section 2. A dual crisis. Imagine a country where the very ground beneath your feet is disappearing. That's the reality for millions of Bangladeshis living in low-lying coastal areas. Rising sea levels are swallowing entire villages, turning fertile farmland into salty wastelands, and displacing communities that have lived there for generations. It's a slow-motion catastrophe of biblical proportions, but it's not just the coast that's suffering. Inland, Bangladesh is grappling with crippling power shortages. Factories are shutting down, businesses are struggling to operate, and ordinary citizens are left sweltering in the dark. The situation is so dire that the government has resorted to rolling blackouts, plunging the nation into darkness for hours on end. This dual crisis of economic and environmental collapse is pushing Bangladesh to the brink. The country is already home to one of the world's largest populations, and with limited resources and dwindling land, the situation is becoming increasingly untenable. It's like trying to fit 10 pounds of potatoes in a 5-pound sack. The international community needs to step up and provide Bangladesh with the financial and technical assistance it needs to adapt to climate change and build a more sustainable future. Otherwise, this nation of 165 million people could face a humanitarian catastrophe of unimaginable proportions. And frankly, the world has enough problems without Bangladesh becoming the poster child for climate displacement. Right, Yemen, let's be honest, when was the last time you actually thought about Yemen? And no, that time you couldn't find it on a map doesn't count. See, Yemen is what happens when humanity decides to look away while a country actively disintegrates. It's a masterclass in international apathy, and frankly, we should all be ashamed. For almost a decade, Yemen has been ravaged by a brutal civil war, turning what was already a desperately poor nation into, well, a humanitarian catastrophe of almost unimaginable proportions. We're talking millions on the brink of famine, a healthcare system held together by duct tape and prayers, and more cholera than you can shake a ridiculously long stick at. And the kicker? Most of this suffering is entirely preventable. It's not a natural disaster, it's a man-made hellscape fueled by regional power plays and a global arms trade that's more than happy to keep the bullets flying. So, while the world obsesses over the latest iPhone or whatever Elon Musk is threatening to launch into space, Yemen is left to rot. But here's the thing, folks. This isn't just a tragedy for Yemen, it's a warning shot for all of us. Because when we ignore suffering on this scale, we create a breeding ground for instability, extremism, and frankly, more suffering. Now, if the war, famine, and cholera weren't bad enough, Yemen is also staring down the barrel of another existential threat, running out of water. That's right, the entire country. Turns out, when you combine decades of mismanagement with a rapidly changing climate and a dash of good old-fashioned conflict, you get a recipe for one hell of a water crisis. And we're not talking about having to water your lawn a little less often. We're talking about the capital city, Sana'a, potentially becoming the first major city in the world to completely run out of water. Imagine that for a second. No water to drink, to cook with, to wash, to grow crops, nothing. It's a dystopian nightmare scenario that's rapidly becoming a reality for millions of Yemenis. Now you might be thinking, well, surely someone's doing something about this, right? And that's the truly depressing part. While there are aid organizations doing heroic work on the ground, their resources are stretched thin and they can only do so much. Meanwhile, the international community seems content to offer the occasional, strongly worded statement and a pat on the head. So Yemen continues to spiral, a victim of its own internal conflicts and the world's indifference. It's a stark reminder that the line between relative stability and utter chaos is often thinner than we'd like to believe. And if we continue to ignore the warning signs, Yemen might just be the canary in the coal mine for a whole lot more suffering to come. Alright, let's shift gears and talk about Kazakhstan, a country that's often overshadowed by its larger, more volatile neighbor to the north, Russia. You see, for decades, Kazakhstan was known for its vast oil reserves, its nomadic traditions, and its uncanny ability to stay off the radar. But in recent years, things have been changing, and not in a good way. Remember those 2022 protests? Yeah, the ones that started over fuel prices and quickly escalated into a full-blown uprising against the government? Well, they were brutally suppressed, leaving dozens dead and hundreds injured. And while the official narrative might paint a picture of order restored, the reality is far more complex. Because beneath the surface, Kazakhstan is grappling with a whole host of interconnected issues. There's rampant corruption, a widening gap between the rich and the poor, and a growing sense that the government is more interested in enriching itself than in serving its people. Add to that the lingering influence of Russia, which sees Kazakhstan as firmly within its sphere of influence, and you've got a recipe for instability. And as if that wasn't enough, Kazakhstan is also dealing with the toxic legacy of its Soviet past. We're talking about abandoned uranium mines, polluted waterways, and entire regions rendered uninhabitable by decades of environmental neglect. Now, you might think that with all these challenges, Kazakhstan would be looking to distance itself from Russia, especially considering, the whole invading your neighbors thing. But it's not that simple. See, Kazakhstan is sandwiched between Russia and China, two global superpowers with their own ambitions in the region. On the one hand, you've got Russia, which sees Kazakhstan as a vital buffer state and a key source of energy resources. And on the other hand, you've got China, which has been steadily expanding its economic and political influence in Central Asia through its Belt and Road Initiative. So, Kazakhstan is caught in a geopolitical tug-of-war, trying to balance its own interests with the competing demands of its powerful neighbors. It's a delicate balancing act, and one wrong move could have disastrous consequences. And let's not forget about the people of Kazakhstan, who are caught in the middle of all this. They're the ones facing the economic hardship, the environmental degradation, and the political repression. They're the ones who will ultimately determine the fate of their nation. Look, we've covered a lot of ground tonight, from the collapsing economies and political turmoil to the humanitarian crises and environmental disasters. And it's easy to feel overwhelmed, to want to tune it all out and focus on anything else. But here's the thing, we can't afford to look away. Because these crises, as disparate as they may seem, are not isolated incidents. They're interconnected symptoms of a much larger systemic failure. A failure of leadership, a failure of imagination, and a failure of compassion. We live in a world where the pursuit of profit often trumps the needs of people and the planet, where short-term thinking reigns supreme and long-term consequences are ignored until it's too late. And the truly terrifying thing is, this isn't just happening over there in some far-off corner of the world. It's happening everywhere. From the rising cost of living and the climate crisis to the erosion of democratic institutions and the rise of nationalism, the warning signs are all around us. So the next time you hear about a country on the brink, don't just scroll past. Don't let the news wash over you like background noise. Because these stories, as bleak as they may be, are a wake-up call. They're a reminder that the world is a fragile place, and that the choices we make today will have profound consequences for generations to come. So, what are we going to do about it? Are we going to continue down the same path of greed, indifference, and short-sightedness? Or are we going to demand better? From our leaders, from ourselves, from each other? The answer, my friends, is up to us.